So the scope was developed with NCSC, and it will cover all new consumer IoT products. Where there's examples where there's existing legislation that's going to overlap, we've excluded those. And lastly, we're going to be choosing an enforcement authority who's going to be making sure that it actually works in the real world as it's meant to on paper. So they'll have all the powers they need to be able to ensure that manufacturers are doing what they can, help them where appropriate, and obviously have all of the carrots and sticks that you'd expect an enforcement authority to have. So the next steps for us, it's working towards royal assent, i.e. completing the journey and actually having this thing out in the real world. It's developing behind the scenes all of the secondary legislation, because we've designed the PSTI bill to be future-proof. So there's certain parts of it that we want to have the option in the future being able to update where appropriate to make sure it's still offering a good and relevant security baseline. And we've been developing all of those components to make sure that we can launch it as soon as possible. And then obviously we're going to continue to collaborate internationally. So everywhere where standards are being developed, we want to be involved in those discussions. Everywhere that someone internationally is thinking about how to secure IoT devices, we want to be helping them and seeing what they can learn from the lessons and mistakes that we've made along the way. And then lastly, obviously, gathering evidence for future developments, ensuring that it stays relevant. But as I said, it's a whole ecosystem. It's not just the PSTI bill. We want to make sure that we're oxygenating a whole system of healthy support. So we've been supporting the development of assurance schemes. So there's 3 here that DCMS were involved in the initial funding of: the Internet of Toys Assurance Scheme, the Smart TV Cybersecurity Assurance Scheme, and lastly the IASME IoT Security Assured Scheme. And all of these have a slightly different focus, but it's part of our mission to make sure that we are helping a whole system to thrive. And obviously we would have to give a shout out to the work done by IoTSF in helping us with the Oxford Information Labs to develop guidance and webinars that's also helping to ensure that people know how to do the right thing and that they have all the information that they need to do that. Obviously, as I said, it's not just here in the UK that this is a problem. Consumer devices everywhere are vulnerable, and if we see fragmentation across different approaches being taken, that is a huge problem. So our code of practice, as I mentioned, aligns with the ETSI standard, and we go to almost every standards body where they're talking about IoT. So we go to ETSI, we go to ITU, we go to CEN, and we go to ISO. We've seen codes of practice published by India, Australia, which align with those same basic principles that are in the ETSI standard. We've seen Singapore, Finland, Germany, and a host of others creating domestic schemes that also align with those same core security principles. So this is really positive to see a whole, if you look at a world map, you have a genuine spread of countries that are all agreeing that this is what the right first step is to take for security. And we're seeing wider schemes. So for example, the World Economic Forum earlier this year released a statement supporting the adherence to a baseline, and they signposted the ETSI standard as a good starting point for this. And then the UK and India signed a cyber statement earlier this year as well, committing to work even more closely together. So that is everything in a real whistle-stop tour that's happening on the consumer side. I'm obviously happy to answer questions at the end, but also I'll be here for the rest of the day as well. But I'm going to hand over now to Rhys to talk about what we're doing on the enterprise.
Thank you. Hope that actually stays. No? There we go. Just can't move. Yeah, thanks, James. As James said, I'll give you a really brief overview of our work so far into enterprise connected devices, or enterprise IoT. So I suppose it's best to start with our scope and how we're defining enterprise IoT and some of the devices we're talking about. I imagine most, if not all, of these devices are very familiar to you. Just to read them off: enterprise printers, VoIP phones, video conferencing systems, network cameras, basically any connected device used within an enterprise environment has been in scope of this review. What is not in scope is probably the best thing to say, and sort of the thing we're thinking about that requires separate use and separate review basically, and then separate, more evidence gained on is OT. So what is the problem with enterprise IoT? I think maybe I wouldn't need to talk about it if you were in one of the morning sessions, but just briefly, some of the images there give an example of some of the real case use problems of enterprise IoT. But broadly speaking, it offers attackers a different route compared to the consumer world. It offers them a broader attack surface, potentially higher value data to be gained, and a chance of a greater scale of impact from a breach via one of these devices. So just to give you a quick timeline of our review, basically we started out in February 2021 where we commissioned our first lot of evidence. Through there, we've been working very closely with NCSC to develop, or NCSC I should say, have been developing, and we've been working very closely with them, develop a set of new device security principles for enterprise connected devices. So around July, August 2021, we were working very closely to help compile those principles, and we launched our enterprise survey. Through into the new year, we've been testing those principles with confidential vendors, and if you're at Cyber UK back in May 2022, they were published at that event in the beta phase. Moving into the where we are now, we have been working on a select committee inquiry into connected technology, which is looking at sort of the well, connected technologies more broadly speaking in terms of the sinister opportunities they present. And we've also just this week launched a grant competition for a security lab to look into and product test many of these enterprise connected devices that we're talking about. Looking ahead, we're looking to host roundtables to get wider views from industry on our work, and around that time end the grant competition phase. And looking to November, that's when we are envisioning that the final set of the device security principles from NCSC will be published. So just talking about in more detail what our work so far has found, it's many of the broader things that were being talked about earlier today. But we really found that organizations are lacking clarity on how to monitor and protect themselves from these devices. One stat from our survey, in fact, found that only 58% of organizations aren't conducting any security or procurement-related checks at all. Similarly, they're being deployed and relied on by many of these organizations. But even from the IT leaders who are deploying these devices, there's significant concern and a need to do, they feel there's a need to do more. One survey found that only 4% of respondents believed they had no need to improve current IoT practice. And then the threat report really detailed the amount of case use examples out there, such as Nursery Cam, the Strontium back in April 2019, which infected various enterprise IoT devices in the scope of this work. So, and introducing sort of the device security principles in more detail, these have really been born out of the ETSI-EN meter attack framework, zero trust principles, and other pieces of standards and legislation out there. What this is really a recognition of the move away from traditional traditional network security parameters, and also looking to detect compromise through device health and account for the wide range of enterprise connected devices. So what is the concept as a whole? Really, as the bullet point says, it's guidelines to help organizations gain confidence that their connected devices are protected and against and able to detect cyber threats and risks, but it's for manufacturers. These are the 11 principles that were released into beta phase. They're not in any particular order. It describes the overall objective, and each principle contains a wide range set of guidelines within. They explain how we expect the principle to be met, and how they apply to some devices in scope, and some of the threats and risks that require mitigation. This is where we envisage the security principles fitting into the wider work that exists out there, including the PSTI bill, the EN, and adherence to cyber essentials. It's a very rough approximation, but you can see we believe that these principles will really help to secure what we consider, the more advanced threat that enterprise devices face from hostile actors. So what are our next steps? Well, we're commissioning more evidence, as I've sort of explained with the grant. We're looking, that's actually bullet point 2, but yeah, commissioning more evidence, engaging more industry stakeholders via our roundtables, and again, exploring internationally with our partners and other relevant leaders. With the principles, as I mentioned before, they're looking to be published in November, or November Q4 2022, around that time. And there is a manufacturer feedback form now available for review and filling out if you have time to do so. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.